What happened when investigators discovered that the Queen's missing jewels weren't lost at all, but hidden where no one expected? A secret raid at Camilla's residence would uncover more than diamonds and gold. It would expose a truth the palace never wanted the world to know. Before we dive into this extraordinary royal mystery, make sure to subscribe, because this is one story the Crown tried to keep buried forever. In the months following Queen Elizabeth II's passing, the walls of Buckingham Palace carried a silence heavier than grief. Her legacy, built over 70 years of reign, lingered in every corridor, in every ritual, in every glimmering artifact that told the story of British history. But somewhere inside that vast treasury of tradition and trust, something went missing. Something no one was supposed to notice. It began as a whisper among the archivists of the royal collection. 3 pieces unaccounted for: a sapphire necklace, a diamond brooch, and an emerald-studded bracelet. Each of them held immense historical value, not just for their price, but for what they symbolized. The sapphire necklace had once belonged to Queen Victoria. The brooch was a wedding gift from the King of Norway, and the bracelet was rumored to have been one of Elizabeth's most cherished personal treasures. They were more than jewels. They were history. At first, no one dared to speak loudly about their absence. The Queen's passing had thrown the palace into a delicate transition, and any sign of disorganization could be seen as disrespectful to her memory. The official explanation was simple: clerical misplacement. But as the days turned into weeks and the routine audits continued, even the most loyal staff began to sense something wasn't right. Behind closed doors, senior officials in the Royal Collection Department met in private, their faces drawn and voices hushed. Inventory checks were repeated 3 times, vaults re-examined, and each curator questioned. Yet the results were the same: 3 irreplaceable jewels gone without a trace. For an institution built on protocol and precision, such an error was unthinkable. Whispers began to spread through the palace corridors, whispers that soon reached the ears of those far beyond the royal walls. And at the center of those whispers, one name surfaced more than once: Camilla. The new Queen Consort, Camilla's residence, Clarence House, had long been her sanctuary, a place of comfort away from Buckingham's formality. It was also where she reportedly kept her personal jewelry, gifts, and heirlooms from her time as Duchess of Cornwall. According to palace insiders, she had recently requested several older pieces from the royal collection for private review and appraisal. It was supposed to be routine. Members of the royal family often borrowed historical pieces for state functions or personal safekeeping, but this time the paperwork was incomplete. There were missing signatures, vague authorizations, and an unusual delay in the return documentation. The internal investigator, a discreet but respected official named Sir Andrew Fletcher, began to take notice. Fletcher had served the Crown for over 3 decades, having worked closely with the late Queen during her tours and private affairs. He was a man known for loyalty and silence, 2 qualities that made him indispensable and dangerous to those with something to hide. As Fletcher reviewed the palace's internal records, he found inconsistencies that raised quiet alarm. The Queen's sapphire necklace had been last documented at a private restoration facility in Windsor, yet no one at the facility recalled handling it. The diamond brooch had been signed out by a senior member of the royal household, but the signature didn't match any authorized personnel. And the emerald bracelet? It simply vanished from the record, erased as though it had never existed. To the public, nothing had changed. The royal family continued with its duties: opening ceremonies, charity events, appearances before cameras that captured smiles and grace. But behind that veneer, tension brewed. A quiet storm was forming among those tasked with guarding the royal legacy. Fletcher's private inquiry deepened. He met with staff who handled jewelry transportation, vault technicians, and even the palace's security officers. Most were careful with their words, but one assistant, speaking under strict anonymity, mentioned something curious. A few nights prior to the Queen's State Memorial, a private jeweler had been seen entering Clarence House through a side entrance, long after official hours. The jeweler was well known among high society, particularly for his discreet work with select clientele. No record of that visit existed in official logs. It was then Fletcher realized the investigation could no longer remain internal. Quiet misplacement was one thing. Unauthorized possession was another. And if the whispers were true, if these royal artifacts were sitting somewhere they shouldn't be, it would be a scandal that could shake the monarchy at its very core. Meanwhile, within the walls of Clarence House, subtle changes began to draw attention. Staff spoke in softer tones. Deliveries were double-checked. And on one occasion, Camilla herself was overheard speaking sharply with an aide over misplaced items and unnecessary gossip. It wasn't like her to lose composure. But even the most composed faces crack when secrecy becomes heavy. By now, the disappearance had reached the ears of senior palace security. Yet an unspoken rule guided them, discretion above all else. The monarchy's image depended on stability, not scandal. So instead of a public investigation, they chose silence. Files were classified, reports buried, and Fletcher's findings marked for restricted circulation. But silence does not erase truth. It only delays its discovery. Weeks later, Fletcher was summoned to a private meeting at Buckingham Palace. Waiting for him was a small panel of trusted senior officials, among them the king's private secretary. Without pleasantries, he was handed a sealed directive stamped with the royal insignia. The words were few but heavy. Clarence House, internal audit, confidential operation. The king had approved it personally. It would not be a public spectacle, nor even an official investigation. It would be a secret raid, a silent operation meant to confirm what no one dared to say aloud. Somewhere behind the grand facade of royal life, truth was stirring, and by the time it surfaced, it would reveal just how deep the crown's secrets could go. The night chosen for the operation was quiet, the kind of stillness that London rarely offered. A soft drizzle blanketed the streets, muting the city's usual pulse. Inside Clarence House, the lights were dim, most of the staff already dismissed for the evening. To the outside world, it was an ordinary night. But for the small team moving in under direct royal orders, it was anything but ordinary. This was no ordinary inspection. This was a mission cloaked in secrecy, sanctioned by the king himself and executed with military precision. Sir Andrew Fletcher arrived at the site just after midnight. He had been briefed in a closed meeting earlier that evening, receiving strict instructions. There were to be no public records, no written authorizations beyond what the royal secretary had handed him, and no unnecessary witnesses. The team consisted of 5 trusted members of the Royal Security Service, each sworn to confidentiality. Every man understood the weight of the task. They weren't just stepping into a royal residence. They were stepping into history. The operation began quietly. Access to Clarence House had been arranged through the service corridor used by maintenance staff. Fletcher's team moved carefully through narrow halls lined with portraits and artifacts, each step echoing faintly off the polished floors. They carried no insignia, no visible identification, only clearance codes that opened doors with quiet precision. Their mission was simple in outline, but grave in implication. Confirm whether the Queen's missing jewels were being held at Camilla's residence without authorization. In the soft glow of flashlights, the team began their systematic sweep. Fletcher led the group, moving methodically through each section of the property: private drawing rooms, storage chambers, personal offices. He was not there to accuse nor to expose. His goal was truth, pure and simple. But truth, as he knew too well, often came wrapped in discomfort. As the team entered the private lower level, they reached an area few outside Camilla's closest circle had ever seen: her personal jewelry vault. It was a secure, climate-controlled room designed decades ago to hold priceless heirlooms and gifts. The walls were reinforced, the locks modernized, and the logs meticulously maintained. Yet, when Fletcher reviewed the logbook that night, something immediately stood out. The last official entry was dated several months earlier, shortly after the Queen's funeral. Since then, no recorded access had been noted, at least not officially. Fletcher's instinct, honed over decades, told him this was the place to look. He directed 2 guards to stand watch by the entrance while he and the security specialist began scanning the storage compartments. At first glance, the room appeared orderly: velvet trays, crystal cases, all labeled in the precise style the royal household maintained. But then, toward the back, Fletcher noticed something unusual. A mirrored panel slightly misaligned from the wall, its edges faintly marked by fingerprints. He paused. Behind that panel, he suspected, lay something not meant to be found. With careful motion, he pressed against one corner of the frame. A soft click responded, and the panel shifted open, revealing a small, concealed compartment. Inside were 3 jewelry cases, unmarked but unmistakably royal. Fletcher recognized them instantly. He reached for the first, opening it with gloved hands. Under the beam of his flashlight, the sapphire necklace glimmered back at him, its deep blue radiance undimmed by time. The second case revealed the diamond brooch, intricate, unmistakable, still bearing the royal crest. And in the third rested the emerald bracelet, as luminous as the day the Queen had last worn it. For a long, silent moment, no one spoke. The weight of discovery filled the room. Fletcher closed the cases slowly, his expression unreadable. This was no mere administrative oversight. These were the Queen's private treasures, pieces that had vanished from the royal record, now found in the private vault of the Queen Consort. The team documented the find with discreet photographic evidence, ensuring that no images would leave official custody. Every motion was precise, every note recorded in the smallest handwriting, as though they were chronicling not just an investigation, but a moment that would echo for generations. Once the discovery was confirmed, Fletcher contacted the palace through the secure line. The message was brief and formal, as protocol demanded. Items located. Verification complete. Within minutes, the royal secretary acknowledged receipt. The jewels were to remain in secure custody at Clarence House until they could be quietly transferred back to Buckingham Palace under controlled conditions. Yet Fletcher knew the situation was far from over. Finding the jewels was one thing, explaining their presence was another. The following morning, as the city stirred to life, word of the internal audit reached Camilla herself. Accounts from those present later described her reaction as composed, but cold. She maintained that the jewels had been sent to Clarence House for restoration, a process interrupted by logistical delays. The explanation was plausible, perhaps even convenient, but it lacked the supporting documentation that the royal collection required for all transfers. She insisted that no wrongdoing had occurred, that the entire matter was a misunderstanding caused by clerical confusion after the Queen's passing. Still, behind palace walls, tension deepened. King Charles, informed shortly after the discovery, reportedly reacted with visible distress. He had only recently assumed full responsibility for the monarchy, and now found himself facing a situation that, if mishandled, could severely damage the crown's credibility. His immediate order was to contain the situation at all costs. There would be no public scandal, no leaks, and no formal accusations. The matter would be resolved internally, but secrecy is fragile, especially when truth begins to stir beneath it. Within days, the existence of the confidential operation was quietly rumored among select royal correspondents, journalists with deep connections inside the palace. They couldn't prove what had happened, but they sensed a story. Whispers of a security audit at Clarence House began circulating in online forums frequented by royal watchers. A few even speculated about missing royal jewelry, linking it to the Queen's private collection. The palace, aware of the rising chatter, issued a brief statement describing the event as a routine inventory check. It was meant to silence curiosity, but it had the opposite effect. For every rumor denied, 2 more emerged. Fletcher, meanwhile, had completed his official report. In his private notes, the ones not meant for circulation, he summarized his unease. Everything about the discovery felt too deliberate. The hidden compartment, the missing records, the timing. It was as if someone had intended to keep those jewels unseen, at least for a while. Whether that intention was malicious or protective, he could not say. By the end of the week, the jewels were quietly transported back to Buckingham Palace. There were no announcements, no photographs, no public acknowledgement. The cases were restored to their rightful vault, their disappearance and rediscovery erased from official archives as though it had never occurred. But history is not so easily rewritten. And though the palace moved swiftly to close the matter, The echoes of that secret night would continue to reverberate, through corridors, through headlines, and through the hearts of those who still believed that not every mystery inside the royal walls had been solved. Despite every effort to bury the story, silence has a way of cracking under pressure. Within a few days of the operation, whispers of the Clarence House incident began trickling through the invisible channels of royal gossip, the kind that flows quietly between aides, journalists and insiders who knew how to listen. It started with a single message from an anonymous source to a senior correspondent at one of Britain's most respected news outlets. You might want to ask about missing jewels, and why the palace guards paid a midnight visit to Clarence House. At first, the editor dismissed it as tabloid bait. Royal rumors were common, especially after Queen Elizabeth's passing. But then a second message arrived, and this time it came with unnerving precision. Dates, approximate times, even a reference to a hidden vault. Something was happening behind those royal gates, and someone wanted the world to know. Within a week, a quiet investigation began among the press. Reporters started asking subtle questions, to jewelers, to former palace staff, even to members of parliament who had connections with royal security. The story was still under wraps, but the scent of scandal was in the air. And when there's a hint of royal secrecy, the public's fascination only grows stronger. Inside Buckingham Palace, the reaction was swift and cold. A small crisis team convened in the King's private council room to address the emerging threat. Phones were confiscated, records reviewed, and staff members questioned. The official line was clear: deny everything. There had been no raid, no missing jewels, no breach of royal protocol. Every item from the late Queen's collection, they insisted, remained fully accounted for. But the palace's denial arrived too late. Late one evening, a prominent news outlet published a breaking headline across its website: Queen's missing jewels found during secret palace operation. The article was cautious in tone, but its implications were explosive. It claimed that an internal investigation had led to the recovery of several valuable royal artifacts that had disappeared after the Queen's death. It further alleged that the items had been discovered during a discreet audit at Clarence House, the private residence of Queen Camilla. Within minutes, the story went viral. Social media lit up with speculation, photographs of royal jewelry collections, and amateur sleuths comparing old images of the Queen's necklaces with newer appearances by Camilla. Every news program in Britain, and soon across the world, had a variation of the story. Some were restrained, others sensational. But all pointed to one thing: the monarchy was facing one of its most embarrassing controversies in decades. In the days that followed, the royal family's public image began to shift. For years, the British monarchy had weathered storms: personal scandals, political debates, media scrutiny. Yet this felt different. This time, the question wasn't about personal behavior or family disputes. It was about trust. If royal treasures could vanish and reappear under questionable circumstances, what else might be hidden behind the gilded walls? King Charles reportedly spent long hours in private consultation with his advisors. Insiders described him as deeply unsettled, torn between his duty to protect the monarchy and his desire to defend his wife. He had spent years repairing Camilla's public image, reshaping her from the controversial figure of the past into a symbol of stability beside him. And now, the headlines threatened to undo all of it. Camilla, for her part, remained composed in public, but furious in private. According to sources close to her staff, she viewed the entire incident as a betrayal, both by those who had leaked the story and by those who had dared to carry out the raid in the first place. It was an insult, one confidant later told a reporter. To her, it wasn't about the jewels, it was about respect. She felt as though she'd been treated as an outsider all over again. But as the palace scrambled to manage the fallout, Fletcher watched from the sidelines, quietly observing how his discreet operation had turned into a worldwide spectacle. He had never intended for the story to leak, yet a part of him suspected it was inevitable. Too many people had known, too many whispers carried through the walls. He also sensed that the truth, the real truth, had not yet been told, officially. The palace issued a statement calling the report inaccurate and speculative. It reaffirmed that no royal property was ever missing, and that routine audits are a standard part of maintaining the royal collection. The language was measured, polished, and deliberately vague. But the public was not convinced. Opinion polls soon reflected a troubling trend. A growing percentage of the British public began questioning the monarchy's transparency. Newspapers ran editorials demanding accountability, urging the Crown to publish a full inventory of the Queen's personal jewels. Late-night talk shows mocked the incident, calling it the case of the hidden gems. Even foreign commentators joined in, portraying it as another example of outdated secrecy within the royal institution. For the first time in his reign, Charles faced a genuine public relations crisis, one that could not be softened by charity events or ceremonial appearances. His advisors urged him to make a personal statement to address the rumors directly. But Charles, ever cautious, hesitated. He knew that once he spoke, every word would be dissected, every gesture analyzed. Silence, though costly, offered control. Behind the scenes, an internal review continued. Fletcher was summoned once more to provide a detailed briefing, not to the press, but to the highest levels of royal command. He outlined every step of the investigation, every finding, and every precaution taken. The king listened quietly, his expression unreadable. When Fletcher finished, Charles reportedly leaned back, folded his hands, and said only, "Thank you, Andrew. You've done your duty." Yet Fletcher could tell there was something deeper behind the king's eyes, a mixture of gratitude, disappointment, and perhaps even fear. The monarchy had survived for centuries not by accident, but by mastering the art of concealment. Every generation faced its trials, and this was his. As weeks passed, the furor began to fade. The headlines moved on to new distractions, and the story was slowly buried beneath other news cycles. But for those who had been inside the palace during those tense days, the memory lingered, the whispers in the corridors, the sleepless nights, the feeling that something sacred had been quietly shaken. In public, Camilla resumed her duties with her usual grace. She smiled for cameras, greeted dignitaries, and attended charity galas wearing only the simplest of jewelry, a subtle statement that said everything without words. But within the private circles of the royal household, her relationship with certain officials, including Fletcher, grew distant. Trust, once fractured, is not easily repaired. For the outside world, the missing jewels affair became just another royal rumor, a footnote in the endless saga of monarchy and mystery. But inside those walls of history and silence, the truth had left a scar that could not be unseen, and while the jewels had been returned, Fletcher knew the real question was not where they had been, but why they were there in the first place. Because in the royal family, very little happens by accident. Time has a way of dulling public outrage, but inside royal walls, silence does not mean peace, it only means endurance. Weeks had turned into months since the leak, and though the frenzy of headlines had faded, the echoes of that night at Clarence House continued to ripple quietly beneath the surface of royal life. The jewels had been returned, the story denied, and the matter closed, at least officially. Yet for those who had lived through it, nothing felt truly settled. Sir Andrew Fletcher remained at Buckingham Palace, but he noticed how the atmosphere around him had changed. Conversations halted when he entered the room. Files that once passed easily through his desk were now routed elsewhere. He wasn't reprimanded or dismissed. That wasn't how the monarchy handled such things. Instead, he was quietly sidelined, given lesser tasks, and gradually erased from the inner circle of trust. It was the monarchy's way of expressing gratitude, and warning, he understood why. What had been uncovered that night had not just been a discovery of jewels, but a revelation of fracture. The monarchy prided itself on unity, but beneath that gleaming facade, loyalties were complicated, fragile, and at times self-serving. Fletcher had exposed a weakness, not through betrayal, but through duty. And for that, he had become a reminder of something the palace wanted forgotten. Meanwhile, King Charles carried on with his royal duties, his every appearance carefully orchestrated to project calm continuity. Publicly, he spoke of modernization, of compassion, of carrying his mother's legacy forward. Privately, however, Those closest to him noticed a certain weariness that hadn't been there before. The ordeal had left a mark, one that no crown, however heavy, could conceal. For Camilla, the incident became an invisible shadow trailing her every public appearance. No one dared mention it in her presence, yet the glances lingered longer than before. Every time she wore a necklace or brooch in public, social media lit up with comparisons and theories. Some called her misunderstood. Others accused her of entitlement. But the damage was already done. The trust that had taken years to build was once again uncertain, fragile under the weight of rumor. Behind the scenes, a confidential inquiry continued, not to assign guilt, but to understand the chain of events. The conclusion, sanitized and softened, was that administrative errors and miscommunication had led to the jewel's temporary misplacement. It was the most polite way possible to explain a mystery that had no safe explanation. The report was never made public, sealed under palace archives with 100 others like it. Quiet reminders that even in an age of transparency, the crown's deepest secrets remained beyond reach. Still, the whispers persisted. Some within the royal household believed that Camilla had indeed borrowed the jewels for restoration, as she claimed. Others thought there was more to the story, that perhaps the jewels were part of a more complex maneuver, an attempt to consolidate personal influence within the shifting power of the new monarchy. Whatever the truth, it was clear that only a handful of people knew the full story, and none of them would ever speak of it again. As for Fletcher, he contemplated early retirement. The institution he had served his entire life now felt distant, colder, more cautious. He often recalled the moment he opened that hidden compartment, the reflection of sapphire and diamond glinting beneath his flashlight. To most, it had been a discovery of missing treasure. To him, it had been something deeper, a glimpse into the reality that no one outside those walls would ever fully understand. One evening, months after the raid, Fletcher was called unexpectedly to a private audience at the palace. The request came through formal channels, but with an unusual note attached. Personal attendance requested by His Majesty. When he arrived, he found the king alone in his study, the soft hum of an old clock filling the silence. Charles spoke gently, thanking him again for his service, for his loyalty, for his discretion. He assured him that history would remember his integrity, even if the world never knew his name. And then, almost as an afterthought, the king added, "Some things, Andrew, are best left where they belong, in silence." Fletcher bowed, said nothing, and understood perfectly. Outside, the evening sky hung low over London, the city lights flickering against the Thames like reflections of 1,000 untold stories. The monarchy had endured another storm, as it always did, reshaping truth into narrative, turning scandal into history. The jewels, now resting safely once again in the royal vault, became symbols not just of luxury, but of endurance. Shining reminders that what glitters most within the monarchy is often not gold, but control. In time, the world moved on. New headlines replaced the old, new controversies captured attention, and the affair of the Queen's missing jewels slipped quietly into the archives of forgotten intrigue. But somewhere, in the dim halls of the royal collection, Fletcher knew the truth would always remain. Locked away, unspoken, protected not by walls, but by loyalty and fear, because in the House of Kings and Queens truth is not lost. It is simply hidden, polished, guarded, and buried beneath the crown itself. Years later, when most had forgotten the headlines, a quiet exhibition opened in the Royal Collection Gallery. It was titled, "Treasures of a Queen's Legacy," a tribute to Elizabeth II's most iconic jewels, displayed under soft lights and guarded by the same air of reverence the monarchy had cultivated for centuries. Visitors came in droves, marveling at the crown jewels, unaware that among the glittering displays lay the very same sapphire tiara that had once vanished from history, the centerpiece of a scandal buried beneath polished press, statements and royal discretion. Sir Andrew Fletcher, now retired, visited the exhibit on its opening day. His hair had thinned, his posture softened, but his eyes still carried that unmistakable precision, the gaze of a man who had seen too much and spoken too little. He walked slowly through the crowd, the murmurs of awe and admiration surrounding him like the hum of a distant sea. When he reached the tiara, he paused, his reflection merging with the glass. The plaque beneath it read simply, "Recovered and restored, symbol of the Queen's eternal grace. Recovered and restored," words chosen carefully, sanitized of all implication. To the world it was just another artifact in a royal story of elegance and endurance. To Fletcher, it was a quiet reminder that truth within the monarchy is never lost, only rewritten. As he turned to leave, a young museum curator approached him, recognizing the retired investigator from an old palace portrait. "Sir Fletcher," she said softly, her tone respectful but curious, "is it true the jewels were really missing? That there was some kind of cover-up?" He smiled faintly, not with amusement, but with the weary understanding of someone who had long made peace with secrets too heavy to share. "Miss," he replied, "in the world of kings and crowns, stories don't disappear, they just change shape." And with that, he nodded politely and walked away, leaving her standing before the jewels, her curiosity now joined by a trace of unease. Outside, the autumn air bit gently at his face as he strolled toward the Thames. The sun dipped low behind Westminster, bathing the skyline in gold, the same hue that glinted off the jewels he had once unearthed. He thought about the countless men and women who had stood guard over these relics of power, each one believing they were protecting history when in truth they were guarding illusion, the monarchy's most valuable possession. Later that evening, in his modest home overlooking the city, Fletcher sat by his window and opened a small wooden box he had kept locked for years. Inside, wrapped in velvet, was not gold or sapphire, but something far simpler, a handwritten note bearing the late Queen's insignia. It was dated months before her passing. The ink had faded slightly, but the message was unmistakable. "To those who guard the truth, remember, sometimes loyalty requires silence more than words." He folded the note carefully and returned it to its box, feeling an odd sense of calm wash over him. Whatever had been lost, whatever had been hidden, it was all part of a greater design, one that had existed long before him and would continue long after. The monarchy, with all its grandeur and imperfection, thrived on this delicate balance between truth and mystery, between what the world sees and what it must never know. As night fell over London, the lights of Buckingham Palace shimmered in the distance, reflected in the slow-moving water of the Thames. Somewhere behind those walls, new faces now served, new stories quietly unfolded, and new secrets waited for their time to surface. Fletcher watched the reflection of those lights for a long while, before finally whispering to himself, "The jewels were never the treasure, the silence was." And with that, the man who had once uncovered the monarchy's most guarded secret closed his eyes, leaving behind a legacy not of scandal, but of discipline, of understanding that in the world of crowns, what is hidden defines what endures.